Good morning, everybody, and welcome back. As you know, we are discussing political development, and so far we've been focusing on democratization. We've talked about how democratization could be understood as a result of the class struggle between classes with unequal power, landlords and capitalists on the one hand, and middle and working classes on the other. One of those two sides will have the advantage at any given moment, and the success or the failure of a democratic transition will be a product of their confrontation. One of the two sides imposing the transition or the return to autocracy, depending upon who has the upper hand. The economic approach focused on inequality, and it focused on the choices and the alternatives available to the actors under different circumstances. And in particular, we talked about how lower levels of inequality make it more likely that the elites will allow a transition to democracy because democratic politics would involve less of a redistribution of their wealth and income. And where I left you was a scenario I put you in where low levels of inequality present the masses with an incentive to revolt, and in particular to challenge the authoritarian regime. And this is where I left you. Remember that I told you that because inequality is low, the elites are unlikely to repress. And so revolting will be less costly. And in this respect, it makes more sense to carry out a revolt or engage in an uprising. But remember that there's another variable that we considered, and that is the balance of relative class power. And if relative class power favors the elites, revolting may still not be optimal because they would have the balance of power and they would have the advantage. And therefore, a transition would become unlikely because they would impose a return to autocracy. Of course, you could wait for relative class power to change, but the question here is what variables affect that? And how long do you have to wait to change the balance of relative class power? Presumably, it might take a while since it's a slow moving structural variable that relates to the density and the organization of the classes themselves. And remember that a change in the balance of power would require altering the status quo and weakening the elites and strengthening the masses. So that might take some time. But the point that I wanted to make to you is that economic classes, economic interests matter to democratization and matter to regime politics. And levels of inequality matter as well. And so these economic models show us quite a bit about how class interests come into conflict and in tension with one another, and how democratization can be a product of some of the changes in the political economy regarding the strength of the groups, their interests, and their organization. Now, we are addressing a new topic, and that is autocracy and authoritarian institutions. But we're going to be doing this by addressing again the political economy of those institutions. But before we get there, I want to discuss a little bit more with you about the relationship between economic variables and regime transitions. And we'll talk in particular today about economic development and regime transitions. And we'll begin to discuss and address authoritarian rule by talking about the relationship between different levels of economic development and different degrees of democracy or authoritarianism. So we'll begin to get into this new topic, but we'll still continue discussing democratization, and slowly but surely we'll make that shift. But the way I'd like to get us started today is by posing a question to you. And this is entirely hypothetical, and I don't want you to read in any additional information. Just take what I give you in this question and answer it based on the hypothetical that I present to you. And so it's a hypothetical about your income and political regime. And basically, what I want to ask you is, would you rather be rich in a democracy or a dictatorship? And so the question is, income and other economic factors being equal, would you rather be rich in a dictatorship or rich in a democracy, and why? So we'll start this by launching a poll, and just go ahead and answer the poll. And then in a moment, I'm going to incorporate your input. We can think a little bit about the alternatives and why we might choose one or the other. This is one of those interesting questions where it can seem deceptive or not, and it can seem more loaded or not. But it's an interesting question because either way, you wind up thinking critically about the political regime and how it might influence your decision making as a rich person. And if you're like me, this is a luxury that you can't afford. I'm not a rich person. And so this is about as close as I'll get to it. But indulge me and let me know. So far, I'm not struck by the result. I'm seeing about what I expected. But we still have a couple people out, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the last two voters. Good, Rady. That's exactly right. And once you've voted, do go ahead and go to the chat and just tell me briefly, what your reasoning is, why you've chosen what you've chosen. I've already gotten some responses rolling in. Very interested to see your thought process here. That's an interesting and sophisticated, nuanced response, Max. Good, Anna. Yeah, absolutely. I'm very excited and pleased to see that you're engaging in kind of a comparative analysis. Many of you are talking about why you would choose the one and why you would not choose the other. But Jocelyn, assume that your income and your economic factors are equal, right? So say you're in the same economic position in both types of regime. If everything in that regard is equal, which one would you choose, or which one would you select? Still one person out, but we've been at the vote for a while, so I'm going to go ahead and share the results. As you can see, virtually all of you, 15 or 94% of the 16 of the 17 who voted, said that they would choose democracy. And one of you, or 6%, said dictatorship. Now, I'm getting some interesting input in the chat about why students would choose one alternative or the other. And I'm seeing a lot of really interesting and trenchant reflection on this question. But let's hear a little bit more. Does anyone want to talk about or share with the class via the mic why they would choose democracy or dictatorship in this situation?
I chose democracy not particularly because I feel like there'd be more advantages to being rich in a democracy. I kind of thought being rich is being rich, especially with income and the other economic factors being held the same in this situation. So I chose democracy just because I'd rather live in a democracy in general.
Hmm. Okay, so it sounds like there are like some human security and integrity questions that lead you to pick democracy. So it sounds like maybe you feel like you'd be safer.
Yeah, I feel like my wealth may be safer in a democracy.
That seems critical. That seems really important. Good, thank you. Max, do you want to comment?
Sure. While I agree that I think my wealth would be safer in a democracy, I think that if I were to be rich in a dictatorship, I mean, in a dictatorship, there aren't that many that are afforded the ability to be rich, and so that the rights that they have are much more than the average citizen. So, like, let's say, like in Russia, it's not a dictatorship, but the oligarch that was created, those people are intensely rich and really have no limits in what they can do.
Yeah, that's a fair point. So there may be no limit politically to what you can get away with or do, certainly. And so maybe there's a political argument. If all the economic factors are equal, maybe politically the advantages available to you are just outstandingly great or better in a dictatorship. Interesting. Does anyone else want to comment on this and talk about why they would choose either democracy or dictatorship?
I can comment.
Yes, please.
So I said democracy also because in a democracy you have more opportunity rather than in a dictatorship. Your like power, like I guess that comes with money, will come to a halt because like in a democracy, citizens do have a say in government and they are more like they have more say in like rules rather than in the dictatorship you have no say. So I think there's more opportunity with what you can do with your money being in a democracy.
Yeah, so there are some institutional differences, right? Like with regard to the freedom that you would have or you know, the ability to do what you want with your money, but even also as Matt points out, there's sort of like the security and the protection of your assets and the ability to protect and hold your wealth and your income and frankly maybe to not be expropriated by the state, or maybe not risk losing everything if you fall out of favor with the ruling regime. Lucas says that wealth in a dictatorship may not be able to afford you the same opportunity. Maybe in a democracy, you can use your wealth to do more. But more generally, as well as Lucas is picking out, and as many are picking out, especially Anna, in a democracy, your wealth is more secure and you have more protection, right? Because you have rights and liberties. And at least theoretically, if you fall out of favor, so to speak, you don't risk losing all of that at the hands of the dictatorship or the state because of the absence of the rights and liberties that characterizes dictatorship. And you can imagine that maybe in a dictatorship you would have the potential for unrivaled opportunity, but you could also have the potential to lose everything, right? It's sort of like a double-edged sword. Like you can lose everything, you can gain everything, but then you can lose everything. And so, as you can see, politics and economics are not the same. And the choice really is a different choice. But the reason that I pose this question to you is there is a really strong relationship between wealth and democracy. And more generally, what we know is that economic development and improvements in per capita income and in those economic indicators tend to trend with improvements in the level of democracy. And more specifically, and as I'll show you in a minute, what we know is that economic development makes countries more likely to transition to democracy, and higher levels of income and wealth make countries less likely to transition away from democracy. It makes them more likely to remain democratic once they become democratic. But on an individual and an aggregate level, there's a powerful relationship between wealth and democracy. And really, The wealth story has a lot to do with what you just pointed out yourselves in the discussion in the question that we entertained. And really, that's a choice between the two following choices. You know, when you think about the choice between democracy and dictatorship as a rich person, it's really a choice between the following. On the one hand, a system guaranteeing a minimal standard and protection, that's democracy, and a system where you win or lose everything, and that's dictatorship. Sure, in a dictatorship, you can win everything, but you can also lose everything. Fall out of favor with the authoritarian regime, and they can take everything because formal rules and procedures and rights and liberties are a poor guide for behavior. And if there's any doubt, just go ask the privileged in Argentina between 1976 and 1983. That was a period when the military that ruled the country stole and stole and stole from the rich landed aristocrats in Argentina. And it was an example of how dictatorship will not protect your income and your assets. Democracy, by contrast, while it may not present the same unrivaled political opportunity, does at least protect or secure your wealth and your assets better than does dictatorship. Relatively speaking, theoretically, democracy should protect wealth and income better than dictatorship. And so the choice between democracy and dictatorship is really a choice between protection and risk. And so more generally, what we can say is that if you're a rich person, losing it all would be disastrous. Getting a bit more might marginally improve your welfare, but the risk that comes with potentially losing all of it is much, much greater than the marginal benefit that comes from maybe changing or improving your welfare a small little bit. The bottom line is, if you are rich, a dictatorship is a big gamble. Now, here's the ironic thing about this, though. I've been teaching you that transitions to democracy require a weakening of landlords and capitalists and a strengthening of middle and working classes, right? Which seems inconsistent with this notion. But notice that the question I gave you here is actually slightly different. The question is, if it's a choice between an existing democracy and an existing dictatorship, in which system would you rather exist? We're not asking about a transition from one regime to another. We're asking about, once those institutions theoretically exist, which one is preferable given this hypothetical amount of income that you have. It is true that before countries transition to democracy, the economic policies of the regime do typically favor the landowners and capitalists. But it's also true that democracy as a regime type does tend to better protect wealth and income. And we know that, at least theoretically, hypothetically, rights and liberties, including property rights, are more protective of wealth and income. And at least over the long term, you can imagine that democracy would better protect those elites from the potential expropriation or abuse that they could experience at the hands of the dictatorship. Christiana says the alternative argument can be that you can choose being rich in a dictatorship because in a democracy there's things to help the poor, but in a dictatorship, not as much. Yeah, so you could certainly suggest that, maybe, so let's go step back. Yeah, elites can self-provide. And if they associate dictatorship with a skimpier welfare state and lower taxes, they may believe that staying the course and keeping the dictatorship and not transitioning to democracy is preferable. Certainly. This is true. But if we're talking about, the two systems already in existence and it's a choice between one alternative or the other, it is true that democracy should, at least hypothetically, better protect wealth and income and assets. But remember that we talked about what are the interests that a wealthy person has in a dictatorship whose economic policies favor them. Well, probably low taxes, right? Probably consumption-based taxes that fall disproportionately on poor people and and therefore are mainly paid by poor people in terms of the proportion of their income that they pay in taxes. But all else being equal, the institutional arrangements themselves should better protect wealth and in assets when it comes to democracy than dictatorship and authoritarianism. But this is an important discussion and debate in the literature. In fact, we probably have more evidence for the economic development thesis than we do any other theory of democracy. And there are a number of different variants of the development theory of democratization, but they all effectively argue that as countries become more economically developed, they should become more democratic. And this is the wealth and democracy story. There's the modernization theory. The survival story is one variant of the modernization theory. But generally speaking, we can summarize that evidence in the following ways. We can say, for instance, that the evidence does show that democracy is more common in rich countries than poor countries. The evidence does show that transitions to dictatorship become less likely as wealth increases. The evidence does show that transitions to democracy become more likely as wealth increases. And the evidence does show that transitions become less likely as countries become wealthier. And what this means is that transitions from democracy to dictatorship become less likely. Countries on the whole become more likely to democratize and more likely to remain democratic at higher levels of economic development. The only country beyond a median income of about $7,000 a year per person to not remain democratic is Argentina in 1976. And the point of that example is to show that typically countries stay democratic once they get to a certain level of development because the incentives that the regime present lead especially rich or wealthier people to choose to stay the course for these different reasons related to how the institutions protect their wealth and their income. And so, although we didn't have time in this class to go into a deep analysis of these theories, what I wanted to show you is that on balance, the evidence does suggest that there's a powerful relationship between economic development and democracy, and that development is a factor in democratization. So our topic for this week, and that we're shifting to now, is autocracy and authoritarian rule. This is a topic that we're addressing in a class on political economy because, well, as you've already seen, we can develop economic models of political regimes by focusing on class interests, by focusing on the different positions in the economy of the different actors. We can also focus on how political regimes themselves affect the economy. But our focus this week will be the characteristics of authoritarian regimes and the political economy of authoritarian regimes and autocratic institutions. And so what we'll do is we'll talk about the different characteristics, talk about the different economic origins of authoritarian institutions, and we will deal with more generally a political economic analysis of authoritarian institutions. Before we get into the content, let's start with this. Who knows who this is?
That's Pinochet.
So what does he have to do with the class on political economy? Yeah, so Max points out neoliberal reforms. So we know that Chile was the first country to push through those really aggressive neoliberal reforms. But did you know that Pinochet in particular, but the military junta more generally, took power without an economic policy? They seized power on September 11th, 1973. And the primary motivation at that time was to suppress what they perceived to be a socialist and communist threat. But being motivated to suppress what is perceived to be a communist threat is different than having an economic policy. And in fact, at that time, the military and Pinochet objected to an economic program that would promote liberal reforms. They did, they really did. The military and Pinochet, they were corporatist, statist, sort of nationalist in outlook. And their viewpoint was very much one at home in the ISI playbook. And for several months, the junta, and Pinochet in particular, sort of entered into these dialogues with what would eventually become the military's economic team, the Chicago Boys, about how to manage the economy and about what to do with the economy. And the importance of the Chicago Boys was that they shaped Pinochet's economic policy. But not only that, they also helped Pinochet to alter the balance of power within the junta. So what began as a collegial military junta 3 months in turned into an increasingly personalistic, autocratic dictatorship, precisely because Pinochet began to forge alliances with the Chicago Boys. Now, the Chicago Boys, as you know, were these Chilean economists who had been trained at the University of Chicago in the United States. It worked with Milton Friedman, who was the core proponent and architect of what was called the public choice theory. Public choice theory emphasized viewing economic policy and viewing the economy as really the product of a series of choices made by interest groups acting based on self-interest. And that the key was to design the economy such that individuals and individual interests trumped state and central government and those traditional ISI corporatist interests. But it wasn't just that they had been trained by Milton Friedman. The Chicago boys also had very, very close relationships with the Chilean aristocrats, the elites, the landlords and capitalists who controlled Chilean society. Now, these Chicago boys had close relationships with the neoliberal landlords and capitalists and were trained by Milton Friedman. And so they were an important medium, a conduit for what became exchange and relationships between that Chilean elite in this emerging school of thought around classical and liberal public choice economics in the United States. And so if you had the idea that Pinochet himself was a neoliberal, you were mistaken. In fact, the Chicago boys had to prevail upon him and persuade him that the best political strategy for consolidating power within the junta was to endorse public choice economics in neoliberal reform and to align himself with those economic interests in Chile, the landlords and the capitalists, essentially 50 families who controlled most of the arable land and much of the fixed capital in Chile. This is the essence of political economy, the marriage of politics and economics. Different groups in society have different interests. They also have different capacities, different abilities to influence politics. They come together and they form coalitions based upon shared interests, and they make decisions that everyone in society has to obey. And they do so under the rules of the game. At this time in Chile, those rules of the game were authoritarian. And those authoritarian rules of the game, imposed from above by Pinochet and the junta, and in concert with US support and eventually the support of Chilean capitalists, were very, very, very repressive and authoritarian. Those institutions, those authoritarian institutions, they are ideal typical in the sense that the Chilean military regime was a classical example of a dictatorship. And it was so quintessential that for about 25 years until the early 2000s, the conventional wisdom in the political economy of reform was that you have to have a powerful executive capable of imposing neoliberal reforms because they are so objectionable otherwise that no democratic public will vote for a leader who would impose them. You have to have a Pinochet. You've got to have a military junta capable and willing to use the power of the state to impose these reforms. And this military junta must be acting with the support of the business class and the elite economic interests, because otherwise it's not possible to push through these changes. And as evidence, they pointed to the example of Argentina, where the business class and the elites had actually developed a very different set of interests. They didn't depend on their exclusive atomistic control. Instead, they depended on cronyistic relationships with the state that provided them subsidies and tax breaks, sweetheart deals with state firms. My point is, authoritarian rule has to be understood in concert with economic policy. In the political economy of authoritarian rule, exposes the relationship between political and economic interests. And so to understand authoritarian rule, we've got to begin to understand the relationship between politics and economics and how the power of the state becomes so essential to the establishment and the translation of interest into policy. We'll start with this discussion of Chile under Pinochet, but there are many examples that could be useful in exploring this topic. Let's start in a very, very broad way. Democracy is basically a regime where those who are governed are selected through contested elections. So, in a strict, limited sense, democracy is about contestation and political competition. It's about a race between elites to obtain control of an office through winning the support of the public. It's really about three things. And these three things fall under the rubric of contestation. First, ex ante uncertainty. Is the election outcome unknown beforehand? Or is who takes power unknown beforehand? Second, ex post irreversibility. Does the election winner actually take place? And then third, repeatability. Do elections occur at regular and known intervals? So if the election outcome is known beforehand, it's not a democratic regime. It has to be unclear who the winner will be. Or if it's known beforehand who will be in power, it's not a democratic regime. If the winner of the election doesn't actually take office, it's not a democratic regime. It's an authoritarian regime. If elections don't occur at regular and known intervals, it's not a democratic regime. This is a strict procedural definition of democracy. It's also a procedural definition of authoritarianism because violation of any one of these dimensions means that it's not a full democracy in a limited procedural sense. Now, we could define democracy in substantive terms as well, but that's less useful for us because we're interested in political development in institutions, in formal institutions in particular. And so we'll focus more narrowly on institutional efficiencies and deficiencies, and those often relate to elections, the way that we select rulers, the ways that societies make decisions about who governs them. So in Chile in 1973, after September 11th, it clearly was not a democratic regime. It was clearly an authoritarian regime because, well, first of all, there was no election outcome. There was no election. The winner of the previous election, Allende, Salvador Allende, who won handily and won fairly, did not take office and was removed from office and murdered. And after this, legislative and electoral institutions were suspended. The next election that took place, which I think was in 1982, took place under military armed guard. And so, by all indications, Chile was an authoritarian regime. But this is a narrow procedural definition. There are other characteristics of authoritarian rule that would help us to distinguish between a democratic and an authoritarian regime. And so we wouldn't want to just look narrowly at these institutional characteristics that relate to competition. We would also want to look, for example, at the characteristics of the regime. And in particular, the way that power is wielded once the election has or has not taken place and once an actual government is constituted. And so there are some key characteristics of an authoritarian regime, and these are the characteristics that will capture most of the variation and will help us to understand in more detail what these look like in the wild. And so generally, and by definition, an authoritarian regime involves a leader or a small group wielding power within ill-defined limits. Now, formally ill-defined limits, there may be laws on the books, and they may have been on the books since before the collapse of democracy from a earlier period. But those formal rules and those boundaries, they are a poor guide to behavior because they are frequently or routinely denied or ignored. The Constitution or formal laws don't guide behavior. Instead, what guides behavior is power and a monopoly on authority that's been established by the leader or the group at the apex of the state. In Chile, that was Pinochet. At the start of the regime, it was the junta itself. But as I explained to you, within a few months, Pinochet had consolidated power within the junta, within the regime, and the regime had emerged as a personalistic dictatorship. Not many people know that. It's commonly misunderstood. It's thought of commonly as a personalistic regime from the beginning. Many people assume that Pinochet himself led the coup. He did not. It was a collegial junta for 3 or 4 months. But the point that I want to make to you is that an authoritarian regime is always characterized by this concentration of power within the hands of a single leader or a small group. It could be a junta or a general within the junta who is able to concentrate and consolidate power, but they wield power within formally ill-defined limits. And so they may issue a state of emergency or use a variety of legal mechanisms to suppress the legislature or the Congress or the courts or other institutions, but generally speaking, their behavior is characterized by arbitrary rule within ill-defined limits. But in addition to formal laws and constitutions being a poor guide, there's a suppression of social and political pluralism. So political parties are shuttered, legislatures are closed or dissolved. There is a general shutdown of civil society, and there is a demobilization of groups that previously functioned as important interlocutors between citizens and the state. There's a demobilization of citizens in political society. And this is intended to minimize any threat to the regime and any threat to the consolidation of power by that elite at the apex of the state. And so this is a regime that's characterized by a lack of political competition and a lack of order and process and procedure and formality, as well as limitations imposed on social and political pluralism, repression and demobilization, and in general, crushing those sources of dissent or potential opposition to the regime. Now, this, of course, all seems very political, doesn't it? But what's the economic dimension? And how does political power begin to relate to the form of the economy or the economic activity that takes place at a given moment? Well, consider the Chilean case, for example. In Chile, the military regime immediately suppressed unions and immediately installed what were called interventores. And these were basically officials who were installed within the unions to impose the military viewpoint and to cripple and demobilize the unions. This kind of demobilization was systematic, and it was intended to, of course, prevent and stop large-scale strikes, expedite and reestablish productivity, and it was intended to promote the interests of the landlords and the capitalists whose investments were the primary victims of labor strikes or work stoppages. The neoliberal Pinochet regime was focused from the very, very beginning on expediting and hastening the process of labor demobilization and in the service of capital. The only way to impose those neoliberal reforms and the only way to crush the opposition and to crush the momentum that was built up for the transition to socialism was to crush the unions. And the unions were so strong that it required those interventores, and it required a great deal of concentration of authority at the apex of the state that I talked to you about that would dominate the literature for the next 25 years. And more generally, it also involved imposing a variety of changes that were very, very aggressive and very, very harsh. And so, for instance, immediately within the first few months, they began drawing up a privatization plan, and mass privatization started within the first year. And in the space of a couple of years, hundreds and hundreds of huge enterprises were privatized, mass layoffs took place. By the late 70s, unemployment was reaching as high as 25 and 26%. And by the early 1980s, Chile actually had a large debt crisis because of a variety of policy miscalculations and problems that weren't effectively dealt with. And in fact, although the Chilean dictatorship is so closely associated with the neoliberal reforms and the apparent success of the neoliberal reforms, in 1982, the debt crisis was so severe that it set in motion what was eventually the beginning of the end of the regime. And the labor mobilization and the collective action within society against the continuation of authoritarian rule became so intense that by the mid 1980s, the end of the dictatorship was visible, and it was within sight. And many people say that in Chile, the transition was an elite negotiation. It was, but the elite negotiation began in the first place because civil society and the unions especially organized in such large numbers in response to the debt crisis and the inability of the authoritarian regime to manage the economy during that moment. And that was a period where global and international oil crises affected Latin American countries far and wide. And the Pinochet dictatorship was not immune from some of those crises. And in particular, the fact that Latin American countries like Chile had obtained a lot of foreign loans that were denominated in US dollars, that meant that when the Volcker shock in the US occurred and interest rates were increased, the floating interest rates on those loans skyrocketed, and the interest burden on those loans grew enormously overnight. And so the Pinochet regime, as well as virtually every other Latin American country, had an immediate crisis. And it made no difference whether the regime was democratic or authoritarian. They were unable to manage those crises. And so that was the beginning of the end for Pinochet. On Friday, we will continue talking about authoritarian rule. And we're going to address the question of political institutions under authoritarian rule. And we'll talk a little bit more about economic interests and the function of different institutions. But it was very good to see you, everybody. And I'll see you on Friday. I hope you have a good remainder of your week.